And now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce a man who needs no introduction, but we owe him a lot because he came up with the idea of this great World Conference on Freemasonry. And I'm talking about Dr. Paul Rich, President of the Policy Studies Organization, and also a distinguished fellow at the Public Policy School at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Paul Rich will be introducing Professor Margaret Jacob from University of California, Los Angeles. Thank you.
If there is anything that we can do to make your attendance more comfortable, just tell the people at the registration desk and we will do whatever we can. We are so grateful to the National Library. They have been so very cooperative. You couldn't ask for better partners. And we're also glad that the American Public University sent a delegation. Today we have a unique privilege of hearing from someone who has unstintingly given of herself to her students and her fellow faculty, but moreover to the wider world of scholarship in bridging the gap between the various studies of Freemasonry and the wider world of the Enlightenment. And by her enormous facility with languages and a great deal of hard work has, in my opinion, changed the landscape of scholarship permanently and made all of our subjects more germane to the mainstream of academia. At the 2017 conference, we will be discussing at the workshop and elsewhere the Chevalier Ramsay, who was a unique figure both in the Masonic life of France and the aristocratic life of not only France but other countries, and remains an enigmatic figure with great controversy over some of his documents. And we will be turning to Margaret, I'm sure, in the coming years for help on how to understand Ramsay when we meet here in 2 years' time. She has accepted the challenge to challenge us and to talk about where we should be going as researchers and scholars. Thank you for coming, Margaret, and thank you for sharing your ideas with us.
Well, you are very kind, Paul, to have invited me. And let me begin by thanking the organizers. This is a remarkable event. The Bibliothèque Nationale is a perfect setting for it. Monsieur Gratin, I want to thank you. Brent Morris, John Cooper, Pierre Mollier. The list is too long for me to remember it all. I also want to thank the Masonic Foundation of California, which makes possible, through its generosity, funds that underwrite a new curriculum. We are the first university in the United States. There are many in Europe, but we are the first in the United States to establish a curriculum in the history of Freemasonry in Latin America, in Europe, and in America. And it is only through the generosity of the Masonic Foundation and John Cooper in particular that this has happened. So thank you all. Ample evidence exists to suggest that beginning in the 18th century, in both Western Europe and the American colonies, Freemasonry acted as a civilizing influence. In mid-century, London lodges paraded to theaters and actually watched in polite silence. Such was not the case for most audiences in this period. In multiple orations in every European language, we can find Masonic brothers praising the order for its practices of friendship and mutual respect. An orator in Paris during the 1780s told his brothers, quote, "The hearts of Masons touch one another everywhere, at every point. The happiness of one is necessarily the happiness of all." In the same period, Masonic orators said, "Every lodge is a democracy." British orators proclaimed, "We wish to unite all men of an agreeable humor and enlightened understanding, and furthermore, all men are by nature brethren, so consequently, all men are by nature equal." Dutch Freemasons said that the entire world is a republic. Each nation is a family. Every individual is a son. In the first century of its existence, Masonic idealism about society and humankind was infectious. In the same spirit, French Freemasons of the 1780s provided cash to brothers or their widows who'd been caught in distress or poverty. They asked brothers who were doctors to assist ill brothers and to do so without a fee. Dutch and Belgian lodges had similar funds. Uniformly in their letters to the Grand Orient, the supplicants recount their social probity and hard work when times were good. Bad luck and not bad behavior explained their need. The lodges sought to make up for the failings of the market society without, for a second, repudiating the financial inequities of the societies in which they lived. Unlike most of French society, the Freemasons regularly elected their leaders and expected them to speak knowledgeably about Masonic ideals. In The Hague, at mid-century, the Constitution Book of a lodge for men and women proclaimed, "Brothers and sisters will deport themselves without vice in order to augment the good manners of society." Yet brothers also sought to hold the world at bay and to offer a corrective to vice, self-interest, superstition, pride, and corruption. They regularly referred to non-Masons as the profane. Especially in Catholic Europe, Freemasons kept a low profile while working to assist brothers, orphans, and the indigent more generally. There was a tension between Masonic ideals and a fear of notoriety in the public gaze. That was then. What about now? In the English-speaking world, lodges have frequently taken their direction from the behavior of the British Grand Lodge. At least that was the case in the 20th century, up to the end of World War II. In the early decades of the last century, the Grand Lodge opted for discretion, for not being seen nor heard. Its stature was enhanced by royal and aristocratic membership, and its option followed the practices of king and court. The era before 1945 saw extreme right-wing movements throughout continental Europe. Britain was not without its anti-Masonic, anti-Semitic fringe. Discretion avoided vicious public attacks. But first and foremost, the Grand Lodge imitated the mores of king and aristocracy. The less said about them all, the better. The policy had one fatal flaw. The Grand Lodge did not work to counter hostilities or conspiracy theories, as well as common misunderstandings of the purpose of Masonic Brotherhood. Since the 1950s, scandal and fear-mongering in British and American journalism has been on the rise. Witness the phone hacking behavior of the now defunct News of the World. Even a respectable newspaper, The Guardian, said that a Freemason was behind some of the worst behavior to be traced to the news. The consequences over the last 30 years, when journalism became more aggressive, has been a flood of public attention, a fair bit of it negative in tone or content. In January of this year, the British newspaper, The Independent, opened its report on Freemasonry and the police with the following. Secret networks of Freemasons have been used by organized crime gangs to corrupt the criminal justice system, according to a bombshell Metropolitan Police report leaked to The Independent. The response of the Grand Lodge? No comment. 2 years earlier, the BBC had reported that British Freemasons are attempting to reverse the image of secrecy and to talk openly about the order. If that change is underway, it is hard to document. The habit of discretion still holds among the upper classes in Britain, and it continues to dominate official Masonic responses to the scandal-mongering press. If some of this discretion sounds familiar, it may have something to do with a similar reticence found among many American and European Grand Lodges. Masonic charity and philanthropy are indisputable and constitute a singular form of civility and decency. There is nothing reticent about Masonic giving. The issue of incivility in our public discourse, particularly with regard to politics and race, presents a different and more intractable problem. If American and European Grand Lodges were to institute programs to combat public incivility, would they not rapidly move Freemasonry out of its comfort zone of discretion? Such seminars or programs would require inserting the lodges into public discussion. The issue seemed central to the deliberations of the leaders of American Freemasonry when they met in March 2014 in Baltimore. The question of its public persona is as old as Freemasonry, and as the beginning, within 20 years of the founding of the Grand Lodge in 1717, Freemasonry came under attack, and not just in Catholic Europe. The lodges were forbidden in the Dutch Republic because of their Orangist associations. The French police spied upon them. Even in Britain, where they were a homegrown phenomenon, attacks from the pulpit still occurred. Why would present-day Freemasons bother to take the risk of openly engaging with the problem of incivility and in the process throw light on some of the worst offenders? If I may use an American example, no one needs the lodges attacked by Rush Limbaugh. Or, here in France, how about attacks by Jean-Marie Le Pen or Dieudonné? In the United States, the lodges are now already marked for disfavor by radio stations purporting to be Christian. Conspiracy theories still lurk out there in the shadows, as a brief search of the internet will confirm. If it seems that I have made the argument for Freemasons as Masons staying out of the public arena, that is not my intent. Rather, the point needs to be made that in tackling any public issue, especially where politics is involved, the leadership of the Grand Lodges should expect a certain amount of hostility. When I had the privilege of sitting in on discussion groups formed in Baltimore to address the issue of the Masonic response to incivility, I noted that some men were hostile to the very idea of getting involved in any public issue. One particularly hostile brother, when learning that I taught at the University of California, pointedly asked if it still employed the Black American communist Angela Davis. Of course, I could not remember if she had retired or not, but I also noted the tauntingly political nature of the question. Certainly the Grand Lodges have their work cut out for them. Well, how then to proceed? Going back to the original meaning of civil society may provide some assistance. As originally formulated by the German philosopher George Hegel, the concept of civil society denotes a zone of independent social life, separate from the state and from the traditional institutions of society, from church, family, confraternities, etc. It is a place where the individual can be independent, mindful of events, forceful in his or her opinions, and also express the freedom that is the essence of civilized society. For Hegel, the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. The progress of freedom, as postulated by Hegel, would suggest that the uncivil has just as much right to exist as does the polite. But what if the uncivil drives people out of the zone of engagement, forced out by the uncouth, the mean, the impolite, the racist, the sexist, etc.? Men are left to retreat into the privacy of the family or even into the lodge. If that is what is now happening, and it seems to me that it is the case, then participants in civil society have an obligation to change the nature and tone of the discussion. It is no secret that hostility to Muslims and Jews is on the rise in Europe. Are the lodges willing or able to address the issue? We think of Freemasonry as a part of civil society, but currently an odd, cautious part. The lodges eschew politics and religion, sometimes more in the breach than in the execution, but does that render them ineffective when or if they participate in the public sphere? Could the current reticence to engage with the reality of the uncivil signal a retreat inward? It may. But if it does, then the lodges need to rethink their role in a republic. At its 18th century origins, Freemasonry proclaimed values very much derived from what may be described as classical republicanism. Virtue lay at the heart of an ethical society, one that eschewed mindless luxury, greed, and self-interest. Consequently, lodges on either side of the Atlantic or of the Channel talked about moral regeneration, about how patriots could obey the laws and still work to reform society and government. Masonic orators invoked the Roman Republic as the ancient site where republican virtue was practiced and applied. Clearly, those ideals would work best in actual republics, such as were created in the late 18th century here and in North America. Let us go back to the 18th century Masonic leaders, the theorists of the movement, and look for guidance. Late in the century, German Freemasons responded to the tone that Gotthold Lessing set in his important Masonic dialogue, Ernst und Volk. And they too looked outward to the Prussian state and its discontents. As the Freemason Lessing has his fictional character, Volk, tell Ernst, action is required. Quote, deeds, good men and young men, observe their deeds and let them speak for themselves. After reciting the many charitable actions undertaken by German and Swedish Freemasons, Volk extols the necessity of doing good deeds in the world. Throughout the dialogue of Ernst und Volk, certain assumptions are basic. Men and institutions require reform and renewal. Religious differences separate humankind. Freemasons aim at social equality, but they will be no better or worse at it than civil society in general. Writing at precisely the same time, the French Freemason Comte de Mirabeau made a similar observation about the lodges and lamented that many lodges did little more for humankind than the occasional act of charity. Like Mirabeau, like Folk, Mirabeau believed that a brother should never abandon his lodge nor dissuade candidates from becoming members. Neither Lessing nor Mirabeau embraced disillusionment or gave up on the power of brotherhood, if properly disciplined, to enlighten humankind and to reform the state. But the wholehearted embrace of the secular, in order to do that, Folk turns to the state. By being centered in die bürgerliche Gesellschaft, Folk can ask, do you believe that men were created for the state or that states are for men? He notes that states create divisions around wealth or religion. This meditation on the need for reform allows Lessing to return to Freemasonry and to castigate the refusal of its German form to admit Jews. By contrast, Mirabeau, inspired by the goals of Freemasonry despite its many flaws, would set up a parallel organization to aid all of humankind through education and, most importantly, through the reform of law and government. Its members must be Freemasons and labor for the one object of the order of Freemasonry, the good of all humankind. As Mirabeau describes it, the second great object is the correction of the actual system of law and government. This correction can be special or general, gradual or sudden, secret or open. There was plenty with which to fault the lodges of the 18th century. Folk finds objectionable the superstitions about the Knights Templar, the recourse to the magical arts, the play with words, gestures, and symbols, and not least, the inability to promote true and absolute equality. Yet Folk clearly implies that there are Freemasons who support the American Revolution. Ernst und Folk directs the impulse for reform outward toward the state and then inward toward the lodges of the day. Folk, speaking for Lessing, locates Freemasonry as a state of mind, a way of being in the world, and not as the imperfect behavior that he, along with Mirabeau, so readily observed in everyday lodges. In the wake of the French Revolution, Johann Herder offered his own meditation on Freemasonry and the state in the form of a dialogue that is clearly in dialogue with Ernst und Folk. He begins by embracing all the good that has been done in the world. Herder, himself a Freemason, reiterates, in the world. He starts with Folk's question, are men created for the state or the state for men? He then, like Folk, notes all the divisions that states impose upon men, and he ends by invoking his desire to have a society composed of all the thinking men in the entire world. Herder's embrace of a cosmopolitan and utopian order is another example of Masonic language being employed to investigate the ideal of civil society. This order, too, is perfectly in keeping with the logic of the secular impulse that begets attention to civil society and the state. One final point needs to be stressed when we assess the political meaning of the enlightened search for social reform, and it has to do with religiosity. I will take as my example the thought of a true revolutionary, Benjamin Franklin. In 1782, we find Franklin here in Paris as master of the Lodge Le Vénérable. And for the next few decades, indeed, when he was first initiated in Philadelphia, Franklin was a quite active Freemason and a leader within the American lodges. Very shortly after Franklin joined the St. John's Lodge in Philadelphia, according to his autobiography, he decided, there seems to me at present to be a great occasion for a united party of virtue. By forming the virtuous and good men of all nations into a regular body, to be governed by suitable good and wise rules, which good and wise men may properly be more unanimous in their obedience to than common people are to common laws. To these ends, Franklin later recalled, he had spent much of that period of his life trying to discover what every religion had in common, so that it could serve as a foundation for a universal natural religion to which all could agree. Of the ethical principles he recalled, the most striking and the most relevant was that the most acceptable service of God is doing good to man. Franklin drew more from Freemasonry than the search for a universal natural religion. He also learned lessons in group behavior and political organizing. In 1774, he co-founded with David Williams the Society of the 13, a deistic circle. Included in the original membership were Franklin, Williams, and a whole host of other Republicans. All the men in it or associated with the group were radical Whigs and Republicans. They were not entirely wrong in thinking of themselves as persecuted. Richard Price, Joseph Priestley, Thomas Paine, David Hartley were among the big names associated with the group. Vaughan corresponded extensively with Franklin and was more familiar than most with Franklin's attempts at elucidating an ethical system. All of these men supported the American Revolution, and the group served above all else to get English and French radicals safely and secretly across the Atlantic. Thomas Jefferson, even though his temperament was not for secret societies and philosophical liturgies, nevertheless knew of the group and corresponded with its members, and as a deist, shared their views on religion and politics. Franklin, Price, and Priestley were associated with another British radical and Republican organization that was obviously descended from Masonic influence, the Grand Lodge of the Constitutional Whigs, traced its origins back to the Glorious Revolution and the preceding years of oppositional and Republican political thought. The Western form of republicanism, now modern and no longer classical, is central to the Masonic legacy with its debt to the Enlightenment. It is not about the contemporary left or right, liberal or conservative, white or black, male or female. It is about virtuous behavior appropriate to citizens of a republic. Incivility is the antithesis of Republican virtue precisely because it actually works to stifle freedom of expression. If this argument has merit, then how do contemporary Freemasons proceed? Look at the rules of civil behavior, spoken or tacit, that characterize any lodge meetings. Can these be codified and taught to anyone of goodwill? I suspect they can be. Are there specific forms of behavior that brothers seek to avoid? Can they be enumerated and presented to audiences interested in the secrets of Freemasonry who also learn in the process about civility? In Italian male and female Freemasonry, the custom of remaining silent during one's first year of membership is widespread. Is there anything comparable in the European and American lodges that might serve to make people stop and think before speaking. Finally, there is the tortured history of race relations within American and African Freemasonry. It is no secret that a crude segregation prevailed for over a century, and in the American South may still be seen in some lodges. Yet, enormous strides have been made to bring white and black brothers together. How did brothers do this? What principles guided the integration, and what have been its benefits? Could local Freemasons hold workshops to bring together blacks and whites, or Muslims and Jews, in a common cause of brotherhood? Finally, the lodges have considerable experience with philanthropy, particularly in the area of healthcare. And there they may have things that they can teach to hospital administrators and others who are looking to improve the management of their facilities. In the British Grand Lodge, silence and discretion have reigned for so long. Do American and European lodges want to follow the same path? Everywhere we live in republics without monarchy or aristocracy, or at best, in the Dutch and British cases, titular monarchy. Leadership comes from representatives of the citizenry. Do Masonic citizens have a particular responsibility to address social ills, to aid their fellow man? Those are questions that only you, Freemasons, can answer. Armed with their history of Republican idealism, let the questioning begin. Thank you.
Margaret, we have here people studying every conceivable aspect of fraternalism. If you were asked if we were all your PhD students and we were fishing to try to find out what would make a good topic, what are on your short list of uninvestigated or poorly investigated or inadequately investigated topics that people like us who do research might pause and consider for our further efforts?
Well, one of your superb French Masonic historian, Cécile Révauger, has begun to investigate the way in which white-black relations worked in the American colonies and in modern America. I think that is the question of race and the way in which it has played out in the lodges everywhere in the world is extremely important, and one that I think people will more and more seek to address. We need more histories than we now have of the role Freemasonry played in the European colonies. Jessica Jacobs has done an excellent book on British imperialism and the role of Freemasonry. And one of the conclusions to which she came was that in the first instance, the British lodges enforced imperial domination. They represented the crown and the power. But gradually, the men that the indigenous people they brought into the lodges read, listened, and thought, these people are talking about equality, reform. I think this has something to do with us. And so the lodges became, in India and various other parts of the British Empire, places where opposition developed to imperial rule. This is a very complicated process, and I'm sure it has to be looked at carefully in all of the French, Dutch, British colonies. I'm sure each case is going to be slightly different. Not least, I think we need a series of studies on the relationship between 20th century fascism and Freemasonry. It's not a simple either or. I'm sure there was some collaboration that occurred, But we need to understand the sources of the way in which the myth of the Jewish Masonic conspiracy played out in 20th century Europe and now, sadly, in the 20th century Middle East, 21st century Middle East.
Can I ask you, do you think during the last 300 years you discern all during those eons a distinct difference between French and Latin Freemasonry and Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry?
Wow. Normally we do about 50 years and consider ourselves hard-pressed to do that. So 300 years. The Scottish Rite is very different, and it is was practiced on the continent. You find it in the United States as well now, but it's a very different kind of Freemasonry. And I was delighted at the conference yesterday and the day before that during the Franken manuscripts, there are Masonic scholars who are now trying to understand how those differences play out. And they do make a difference between Anglo-Saxon Masonry and Latin and European Masonry. That's one piece of it. The other piece is the way in which aristocratic leadership has been used in different ways in different places. And finally, my colleague Maru Vasquez has now written and published a very important book on the role of Freemasonry in the liberation of Mexico in the early 19th century. You cannot do the political history of many Latin American countries without spending time to understand the role that Freemasons and Freemasonry played in that process of liberation. So there's lots to do.
And before asking if there are any questions in the audience, because we do have a little time, looking towards the theme for 2017, an examination of the Chevalier Ramsey, in your studies, because you have certainly looked at that period, how significant a figure do you consider him?
It's difficult to say. I've done a little bit on Ramsey. I'm not sure how much manuscript material remains. The famous oration that he gave about the need for an encyclopedia of all learning was an attempt, I believe, to make possible a Christian encyclopedia and not what Diderot and friends produced. So he's an interesting combination of wanting to be a Christian, probably I think a Jacobite, and a Freemason. His orations turn up in manuscript form in a number of archives in Europe. So there's an international Ramsey as well. But I think the first thing to do is to try to find more archives on him.
Now, do we have a mic to help anybody? We do. If you have a question, we have a few minutes remaining, and Guillermo has a mic, and if you will stand or make a fuss, we can give you a mic, and Margaret has graciously said she would be willing to listen or take a question or two.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes. Thank you very much for that interesting talk. It seems to me kind of like what you were saying maybe, is that there's powerful alignments right now between elitism, religious fundamentalism, and political power. Do you think perhaps the reason that Freemasonry is so much under attack is because its democratization, its democratic ideals are a threat to those power structures?
Not quite sure. Could you rephrase that? I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Okay, but you were talking about kind of the Christian fundamentalist radio shows in the United States that were attacking Freemasonry. Like kind of the alignment of power, money, elitism, religious fundamentalism in the U.S. right now in particular. Do you think that maybe the reason that Freemasonry is so much under attack is because its democratic ideals are a threat to those kinds of power structures?
Well, this is a complicated question. It is true that if you look at the anti-Masonic propaganda, much of it has an origin in Christian fundamentalism, one church or another, some more bizarre than the next. How that works out in daily practice, I'm not entirely sure. I believe you can certainly find American Baptists who are also Freemasons. But whether they keep the second part quiet, I don't know. I think it's an area that certainly needs to be looked at in white America. I think black Freemasonry has a very different profile and is not affiliated with this sort of Christian fundamentalism, which I think is rather overwhelmingly a white phenomenon.
I'll try again. Okay. Actually, an editorial, the African American Freemasonry is heavily steeped in Christian fundamentalism. Maybe we'll speak a bit afterwards about it in greater detail. My question is, with respect to civility, how do you juxtapose or how do you reconcile the impact of social media on how Freemasons, as well as social and other cultural issues, have come on the horizon, for lack of a better word? The interplay between.
I think it depends country to country. Most American social media pays no attention to Freemasonry, except when something becomes an issue. And then they're on my doorstep or somebody else's doorstep wanting an interview to find out, what does this all mean? So I think the American media is on the whole rather innocent of what goes on, what Freemasonry means. That is not the case in France. I think France has a very intelligent public, and the best scholarship in the history of Freemasonry is done here. No question about it in my mind. So I think it varies from country to country.
About 10 minutes into your paper, you referred to the British Grand Lodge. Could you clarify that you actually meant the United Grand Lodge of England as opposed to the Grand Lodge of Scotland or the Grand Lodge of Ireland?
I did mean the United, yes. I mean the group that in the mid-'70s denied me access to their library. That's the group I mean.
Bonjour et merci pour votre exposé, Madame. J'aurais voulu savoir, puisqu'en France, les obédiences irrégulières glosent beaucoup sur la perte des effectifs, la baisse du nombre de francs-maçons aux États-Unis, en Amérique du Nord en général, et aussi dans le monde anglo-saxon. Et j'aurais voulu avoir votre analyse sur cet aspect donc, de la baisse des effectifs de la franc-maçonnerie régulière dans le monde nord-américain.
I think I understood that. It's very difficult to say now what effect Masonry has in North America. It used to be the case that every American president up to Truman was a Freemason. Well, we don't know what that meant exactly, but Earl Warren, the great Supreme Court Justice, was a Freemason. Nowadays, I just think that this is not that important. And, of course, as you know, the membership is falling dramatically. Now, whether there will be a revival is anyone's guess. But I don't see much influence. I mean, Paul can probably answer this better than I can, because I spend my time in universities and classrooms.
Well, I do see its influence in Washington, and it is an influence that wherever people get together, they are bound to discuss things. And the conspiracy theory is applicable to anybody's club or bar or church or anywhere they might gather. So when we have these attacks in America on Freemasonry, they really would only be answered by people ceasing social contact with each other. And if nobody fraternized with anybody ever, there would be no possible allegation of conspiracy. But if you mean that people of power gathering in Washington or elsewhere in a Masonic setting, they also gather at a variety of clubs and variety of what we call watering holes or bars. So that's, again, a difficult question. I have to call attention to the fact that Margaret has agreed graciously to chair a very interesting session tomorrow on the companionage with a world authority on it, which will maybe push back some boundaries and actually, surprisingly, touch on some of the things we have been talking about. Secondly, I will remind you that during the social breaks, we're conferring the awards on the recipients this year of literary awards. And if you do not have your translation equipment, you're free to get it. And I, of course, am so grateful to have Margaret with us during all these sessions. I do have to now turn to the chair of the next session, and he eschews all his various titles and is simply known by his Christian and last name, so I will not belabor who he is, except to say that as president of Westphalia Press, I have an affection for the long-vanished Kingdom of Westphalia, which was a center of the book trade and of publishing in a rather enlightened small kingdom, which, of course, his ancestor, among other things, was King of Westphalia. So it's a happy thing for me to have him here today, and an honor, too. And with that, I will turn the program over to Charles Bonaparte.